What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making some old cassette tapes. Once again, I ended up going down another rabbit hole this week. I was actually planning on making an entirely different model for this week, but I came across this image online showing the internal components of an old cassette tape, and it really got me thinking and wondering how I would model something like this. Now, I've done this in the past multiple times, just start modeling random objects just out of curiosity, but I usually don't record it. It's just for practice, and sometimes when I'm finished and happy with the results, I just wish I did record it so I can share it with my Patrons or on YouTube. So this time, I decided to record it. So for reference, I jumped on Google Images and found an image of the interiors from a top-down view, something that I can use as an image plane just to make my life a lot easier blocking things out and getting the proportions correct. I really wanted to make all of those internal pieces part of the outer shell, kind of like a mold, like they are in real life. Now, I'm not gonna lie, there are much easier ways I could have approached this whole model, and I will go over that later on in the video when we go over the UVs, but until then, I wanted to make a high poly cassette tape, so for now we're just gonna focus on adding edge loops and blocking out all the main interior shapes. Now, I didn't know exactly how I was going to approach this. To be honest, I wasn't even planning on making this for YouTube, so rather than calling this week's video a tutorial, it's more or less just a speed modeling time-lapse type of video, as I was just experimenting along the way and really didn't know which direction I was going to go. In the end, I thought it would still be helpful to show people the process, so I decided to upload it for this week's video. Like I mentioned, I will go over other strategies to approach a model like this. I realized after I was done all the texturing, a lot of the inside components I could have faked and just saved a ton of time modeling, so we'll go over more of that later on in the video. And as always, this video will be available in real time along with all of the working files, so if you're interested in seeing any of that, it will all be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. So as you can already tell, I'm going to start working on just one side of my cassette tape. I went ahead and just deleted the other side, that way it can just save me time working on this one side, and then I can duplicate it and flip it over and reattach it to create the other side once I'm finished. You'll actually see me constantly throughout this whole video doing that to see how the model's looking, and then I'll just go ahead and delete it again just to continue making adjustments to my one side. I luckily had the top view, which showed the general shape of the cassette, but I did not know how thick it was, so we will have to experiment a little bit and just see what feels right and what feels accurate to whatever a real-life cassette would look like. So originally, my main intentions with this model was to make the main focus all those interior components. So I was going to add a see-through plastic on my cassette tape that we can see all those little cool objects on the inside. Now, in the end, I ended up making most of my cassette tapes that normal black plastic color that you usually see. And a big reason for that is just because of Substance Painter's transparent abilities. I find you can get much better cloudy plastic results in other software like Maya or Unreal. So since we're just going to render this straight out of Substance, I decided to change it up a little bit while applying those materials. This is another reason why I could have faked a lot of those internal components to save time, since a lot of that detail really isn't in view in those final renders, and I'll show you a few examples later on in the video of how I would have done things differently if I had to redo this whole model. That being said, it was still really fun, and it's always good practice to make those small details, so let's just continue doing just that, adding some more edge loops and blocking out those internal shapes. I also wanted to make a quick note about topology. Firstly, I definitely slacked a little bit this week, I'm not gonna lie, since I didn't plan this whole model out and I was kind of experimenting along the way. It made cleaning up the model a lot more work than it should have been, and I kind of cut a few corners at the end to get it all done on time. Usually I don't worry too much about topology while I make the main shapes and I block everything out. It just allows me to work a little bit more freely, and then we can always clean things up later down the road when the shapes are more finalized. But I also didn't think I was actually going to post this one on YouTube, so I didn't want to spend my full day working on it and optimizing topology if no one was going to see it, which definitely backfired on me since I ended up using it for this week's video. So lesson learned, I need to plan out my models a little bit better, and don't just dive right into it and just see what happens. It could have saved me a lot of time on the modeling and UVs, and I could have had a cleaner model in the end. Second, the cassette tapes I made were clearly high in polys. I think these ended up being subdivided twice, if I remember correctly, but honestly, it really wasn't necessary. I just had some fun and smoothed it all in the end to get some nice, crisp, smooth edges. I was kind of going for that photoreal look. But a lot of those edge loops we could have cut out and saved on polys, which would have made our model in the end a lot cleaner after subdividing it. But we'll go over that more later on in the video to see what I should have done differently. For now, let's just continue blocking out our main shapes. We can hold back on all the booleans and all those details until everything's all blocked out and looking correct, and then we can start adding in our smaller objects into the scene. Oh, also, if you do enjoy seeing these types of videos and want to see more random weekly 3D models, please consider subscribing to the channel. Alright, let's just continue our modeling. Alright, so here are the cassette tapes in their finished forms. Now, as you can see, I did go ahead and just duplicate a few around the scene to create all the other ones. Originally, I was planning on having just one cassette tape, and then I thought it'd be a lot of fun just having a little pile of them. We can add different labels and make them all look a little bit unique to one another. And also we can have different colors, so one cassette tape could be white, one black, one see-through. We can just play around with the materials later on in Substance Painter. So as you can see, I added this plane really quickly. That way I could just tell where my floor was. So when I moved all these cassettes basically all over the scene, I didn't want any hovering in the air. So I just kind of used it as a guide just to where my ground plane is going to be. Now, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, there were different ways I could approach doing a cassette tape depending on how the model is going to be used. Now, I just wanted to create a higher poly model just for fun, for visual renders, and they weren't being used in the game engine or anything like that. But as you can see, they are pretty dense in polys. I ended up adding 2 subdivisions to it, which added quite a bit to get those really nice smooth edges. I basically had to do that. But there are different ways we could have approached the model, like I said, depending on how it's going to be used. So really quickly, I'll go over exactly how I prepared this model for Substance, and then we'll go over a few things I should have or could have done differently. So in this group, I ended up splitting this thing up into 7 different tapes. Now, don't mind me, these are labeled incorrectly. I will fix this before I upload these models to my Patreon page. But as you can see, I ended up grouping them all, simply adding one material to each cassette. That way I can have a different texture set in Substance Painter so I can easily apply materials to different cassettes. Now, there's also different ways I could have approached this. What I could have done is just combined all of these into one group, or I could have had a lot of the black cassettes that I knew were going to be black in one group so they could be overlapping. That way I could just save space in my UV map, and I can have only the labels on the outside as different textures. So only these pieces where the actual graphics would be going on would be different. But like I said, I wanted to also have different patterns. Some have the lines going across, some have little squares. So I thought it'd be fun having more variation of materials. So that's why I decided to split them up into different groups and different textures. So technically, this whole scene has 7 textures for the 7 different cassette tapes. Now I'll open up the UV editor and I'll show you how I laid those shells out. So as you can see, if I click one of these, you'll see how I laid out these shells. Now what I did for the top face was just duplicate it so it's actually mirroring this side. So as you can see, it's showing red because technically they're flipped. So in a perfect world, I should go through and flip these. But it would also change, these wouldn't be overlapped correctly because they would be flipped, as you can see. So in this situation, it made sense for me just to leave it as is. That way, these 2 shells were overlapping perfectly, and whatever material or texture I added on one side would appear on the other one. Now, all of these cassette tapes are basically the exact same. So if I go through, you will see they are more or less the exact same. The only one that's different is my first one, and that's just because I have a different long tape that's hanging out. I thought it'd be cool to add just one that was kind of not correctly done, or I thought it would just be cool to add something a little bit different. But everything else is the exact same. The most important thing with this was making sure that these shells, especially the ones on the outside, were nice and relatively straight. Now I couldn't use the straighten UV tool because I'm having some curvature around these that it would just mess up all of my topology, but I wanted to align them relatively straight. So if I grab one of these cassettes, I'll isolate it, throw in that checkered board pattern. You can see that it's looking fairly straight. So that way when I add that grid pattern or the line pattern in the bump into the plastic, it'll just be looking correct. Another important thing was the label itself, because I wanted to apply these materials as easily as I could, and rather than creating them from scratch, I just took images from Google that I could just paste directly onto this front face. So the more straight that I had this whole shell, the easier it was for me to paste on that graphic. And I also don't want my textures and my words looking skewed and all warped. So the more straight you can get this, also the better result you would have. And that's basically how I prepared this model. It was pretty straightforward. like I said, just separate them all into their own textures. I could export them all for Substance Painter. Then we can easily just add textures to each individual cassette tape. Now, of course, as you can see, it's quite dense. Now, not only did I should have cleaned it up a little bit prior to adding my subdivisions. That way, when I added the subdivisions, it would look a little bit cleaner in certain areas. But a big reason why I wanted to do this was because of the internals. I really originally wanted to have a see-through plastic material so you can see all of these kind of bump and this plastic shape, the kind of shell that it has, similar to our reference photo that I was using as my image plane. But I realized after adding materials, especially because majority of my cassette tapes weren't see-through, it was just more or less a waste of time. It wasn't completely a waste of time because it was good practice, but I really could have cut back on a lot of time on this model by just simplifying those interior shapes or simplifying the whole model in that case. So what I did for this video was prepare another lower poly cassette tape, and I'll show you exactly how I prepared that. So I'm going to compare it to my higher dense one below. So let me just slide this one over a little bit. So as you can see from a distance, most of my renders were not very, very up close. They were like around this distance. So something like this would look very similar. There's two different ways I could have done this. So if I open up my low poly shell, I'll show you exactly. So I have one that's very low in polys that has no beveled edges, and you could use a high and low poly model workflow if it was for a video game. So you could texture on this one that had the nice beveled edges, and you can just use this lower poly one in game and transfer that information like the curvature from your textures and paste it onto this model that has the no bevels, and you can have that rounded bevel effect. Especially if it's from a view, it would look fine. Now if you want to take it a little step further, you could actually add the bevels like I did onto this model. And it's still very low in polys, and it's not double-sided, as you can see. So you could cut back and do something just like this. Now you could take it another step even further by taking the top shell, let's say, and you could just add some thickness to it. Now, of course, it's not necessary in a lot of situations, but I could extrude that. Now, as you can see, it just added a little bit of thickness to this. So what you could do is if you really wanted to have that kind of not a clean plane and you were getting a little bit closer, maybe adding a little bit of thickness would make sense, but it's not always necessary. So I would probably just leave it one-sided. But like I said, it really depends on how the model is going to be used. But for all of those inside components, so let me just show you with these. You could have faked a lot of this. So what I did here was I basically just blocked out what this inside pattern looks like with a very low poly kind of shell. So as you can see, this inside piece. And I actually don't need to make it attached to the bottom and bevel out all those edges, because not only will it add a ton of polys to my scene, but it's just not necessary depending on how it's used and how I use the model. To be honest, I could have saved a ton of time and probably faked it just by a little tiny inside piece like this. And you probably wouldn't have even known that it wasn't attached. So there's lots we could have done to cut back on polys if we had to. And to be honest, if I was going to redo the model, I probably just would have done it like that just to save, since like I said, the only see-through one we had on our whole cassette tape scene was just this one over here, and you could barely see those extrusions that I made on the inside. So if you would like to cut back on polys, there's definitely more than one way that you could do that. So keep that in mind with this whole video. But I just really wanted to show you a lower poly approach, because you're not always going to be able to have really dense meshes, even though it's fun to do. Oh, and also, of course, I did not add any booleans into the low poly mesh. So as you can see, the main holes here in the middle, you can just add some small booleans afterwards, or you could even fake it and just add some sort of fake graphic that fakes what that hole would look like. Especially for all of these little screws in the corners, you could easily just add that into the texture. So you could fake it with a little bump that's imprinted inwards and a little metal screw as well. So keep that in mind. You don't need to add all of these holes and details, especially these circles, for example. That could easily just be into the bump map. and you don't need to add that directly into your geometry. So I hope that helped explain some of the process and different ways that you could approach these models depending on how you're going to use them. But we are just going to have some good old fun renders in Substance. So I wanted to have those really nice smooth edges and just more or less try to get it a little bit more realistic looking than just like a video game asset. All right, so now that we have our cassettes all separated into their groups and they all have materials applied to them, we can go ahead and select this, we can export it, we can jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Now, just like I mentioned when we were going over those UVs, I decided to jump on Google Images and find different random images of cassette tapes. Mostly they're labels that I could use just to paste directly onto my cassette tape. Now, of course, you can go into Photoshop or whatever software and create your own labels, but just to save time, since I'm trying to get this done in one day, we are just going to steal some from Google and we can just paste them onto our mesh. Now, of course, we can't just use any graphic online. We need to have some that kind of fit with our model. So I spent a little bit of time just off camera, just Googling and searching some, and I found a few that would work. So we are going to go ahead and use these. Now, when it comes to all the other materials in my scene, it's very straightforward. So I just decided to use more or less the same plastic smart material that comes with Substance Painter for all of my cassette tapes, and then I can add different bump effects. So just by adding a fill layer and just turning off all the channels, so there's only a height channel, I could drag on different textures, so a nice grid pattern or a line pattern, and I can just tile those or scale those very, very small, and I can have a nice little bump on my plastic, similar to what you would see in a real life cassette. Now, of course, cassettes change quite drastically, so if you start doing some Googling, you'll realize there's actually quite a bit different variations of cassette tapes out there. So I just decided to keep it fairly straightforward, not stress over it too much, and just kind of approach it depending on however I would imagine these cassettes looking. I didn't want to obsess over getting them perfect, we just wanted to have some fun. Now, after I spend majority of my time texturing one, it's really easy to apply all the others. So it's just gonna be the exact same process. I can just copy and paste the same plastic material from my first cassette, and I can just paste it onto my second and third and so forth. So the texturing process really didn't take too long. It was just more or less experimenting with different looks and feels depending on how I wanted the cassettes to look, if I wanted them to be white or see-through. Now, like I did say earlier, the see-through transparency that Substance Painter gives you is not the best, at least in my opinion. If you have other renderers like Keyshot or I'm sure Marmoset, which I don't use, but there's a lot of other renderers out there that can have some really nice transparent effects and give you that like smoky, kind of foggy plastic look, which I was hoping to achieve, but I realized it would have taken a lot more work than I really wanted to invest into the model. So I ended up making only one of my cassette tapes see-through, which still bugs me a little bit. I feel like I should have spent a bit more time refining that texture, but we're just gonna have some fun. We're gonna start applying random smart materials, fill in all these empty meshes, and then we can start refining those textures afterwards until we get them into a state that we're happy with. So let's just start texturing our cassette tapes. Oh, also, if you're interested in seeing the full UV mapping process in real time, that will be uploaded to my Patreon page. So you can find that all in the link in the description below. All right, let's just start our texturing. All right, and that is basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling and texturing process that I did to create these old cassette tapes. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more random weekly 3D models. And as always, I want to give a really huge thank you to all of my Patreons. You guys are all amazing, and I really can't thank you enough for all of your continuous support. And once again, if you're interested in seeing this whole video in real time, or you just want access to all the working files, all of it will be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. All right, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's video, and I will catch you guys in the next one.